Welcome. And the meeting is being recorded because afterwards you will be able to access the webinar on social media, on YouTube and Facebook in particularly. So the Pandem team will give an update on what we found so far. And of course, we wouldn't be a democracy research institute if we wouldn't allow the audience also to participate. So you will be able to participate as an audience via the platform Slido. And my colleague will post the link shortly. On Slido, you can enter the hashtag Pandem2020 and not only ask your questions, but also vote which question of your colleagues is most relevant and which we should discuss here at the panel. So go to Slido, so sli.do, and use the hashtag Pandem2020 as a password. And then it's very easy to use. You will have the chance to ask questions. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to my colleague, Staffan Lindberg.
Thank you, Anna. And thanks to everyone involved in organizing this important event. And allow me also to thank our guest, the State Secretary, Olsson Fridh. Your presence today signals the commitment of the Swedish government to supporting democracy around the world. This is important, I think, increasingly, as academics and experts agree that the need now to support and protect democracy has never been greater, not at least since the 1930s. That should give us some pause, I think. We live in a world where democracy, once again, has unconcealed enemies. And we also have to face that people across the world no longer necessarily reject these enemies of democracy. Perceived and sometimes real threats across the world create fear and what we have talked about as toxic polarization, feeding urges for a strong leader that can save us. Some 30 years ago, the word was democracy promotion. People across the world who had lived under harsh dictatorships became free citizens with rights and liberties. Today, the opposite is happening. We have lost 36 democracies since the 1990s, and there could be more to come. Democracies, as our Democracy Report 2020 showed, are now in a minority in the world for the first time in decades. And this was before COVID-19. As this seminar will dwell upon, the pandemic has stirred up a lot more fear and been used to further undermine and derail democratic rights and freedoms, especially, of course, by leaders in countries that had already embarked on autocratization. So my conclusion and perspective is that we must now join together as scholars and practitioners and professionals to gather the hard evidence for democracy and enabling a new set of policy advice on democracy protection. And we must do it now. We don't have the luxury to procrastinate. I see today's webinar in this perspective as one very important effort to spread knowledge about how democracy is threatened and what can be done about it. With that, I hand it over to our able chair and speakers on the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Staffan. Now over to you, State Secretary Olsson Fridh.
No, but thank you very much. It's a pleasure for me. I'm very delighted to be with you here today. The V-Dem Institute is an important partner for my government in our work to promote and strengthening democracy. And I want to express my really my sincere appreciation for everyone out there, for all of you who do this excellent work on this Pandemic Backsliding Project. Staffan mentioned now the 1990s when we talked about democracy promotion, and maybe today we're talking more about democracy protection in the 2020s. And that is not a development that we should look upon with ease, but that should guide us and make us act. And I hope that what me and my government is trying to do with our drive for democracy could spark some change and mobilize more actors to join our hands and to do exactly that. Now, we are very proud and happy contributor to this project, of course. it is of the uttermost importance to monitor the consequences of the measures taken by governments these past months, and that we continue to do so. And I think this is exactly the kind of information that we need. Let me come back to those consequences. But I think the need for us to be able to also hold decision makers accountable after this pandemic, and to look back and see what we did and what we can do differently will be extremely important for us. And as we are all aware, and as your research also show, the COVID-19 pandemic risks accelerating the global trends of democratic backsliding and undermine the rule of law and weakening the respect for human rights. This was a backsliding we saw already before, but the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated all of the global trends and crises that we faced already before, and the respect for democracy and rule of law and human rights is no exception, which is rather regrettable. I mean, of course, when you respond to a pandemic, you must do so to bear in mind gender equality, human rights, democracy, and rule of law. This needs to be the core also of a pandemic response. And we see now that maybe a virus doesn't treat people differently, but the pandemic does. And we see also that the inequalities of our world is now being accelerated also through the pandemic. Some states use this current situation as a pretext to restrict the freedom of movement, freedom of expression, or privacy. We need to be vigilant in this regard and prevent the pandemic to become more of a breeding ground for governmental overreach. Any limitations to the enjoyment of human rights must, of course, be in accordance with international law. The use of emergency powers is allowed by international law in response to significant threats. However, any emergency responses must be proportionate, necessary, non-discriminatory, and strictly required by the exigencies of the situation. But more than this, our response to a public health crisis can only be effective and sustained if it's on the basis of human rights. So without the evidence base that your work to monitor these measures that have been taken by governments during the pandemic and what you can provide us with through your work, our arguments would be so much more weaker. And our strive to both promote and protect democracy would be a lot weaker without the work of V-Dem at this point. The consequences of COVID-19 are often aggravated by already weak health systems and weak governance systems, already a vulnerable socioeconomic situation and inequalities, poverty, conflicts, so weak education systems, and so on and so forth. And the pandemic hits hard. Of course, it hits hardest on the poorest countries, even those countries where the virus itself doesn't spread so much as it does, for example, in Sweden and in the United States. The pandemic hits harder in those poorest countries, to those populations most vulnerable, most furthest left behind, already marginalized. And countries and societies will be affected for years to come through the pandemic and how we choose to act to respond to it. And here, of course, again, the monitoring and the work of V-Dem is crucial for us. Now, let me also say a few words on my government's initiative on the drive for democracy. Through the drive for democracy, we're trying to establish a counter narrative to the global democratic backsliding that we've seen for years before the pandemic also, by highlighting the role of democracy for inclusive growth, for participation, for equality, for sustainable development, for governance, but also relating, of course, to human rights, to security issues, and provide support and wherever democracy can grow, and express concern and criticism wherever it is eroded. And we do so through all of our diplomatic toolbox and all through our development cooperation toolbox. Action to support civil society, to strengthen the role of political parties, ensuring the right to freedom of expression, opinion, and information, online as well as offline, is of course crucial in such a drive. And this includes, of course, strengthening free and independent media and work for the safety of journalists and other media workers. Today is actually the International Day to End Impunity on crimes against journalists. 1,000 journalists have been killed the last decades, approximately. 9 out of 10 killers are going free. So we need to end impunity and strengthening also the judicial system in this regard. Now, access to information, important in any society at any place, but of course, extra important during a pandemic, online as well as offline again. But this is a human right, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states that everyone can seek, receive, impart information, ideas through any media, and regardless of frontiers. And like the findings in the Pandemic Backsliding Project, some states have used the COVID-19 outbreak to restrict information, to stifle criticism, an example through internet shutdowns and emergency laws. And this is, of course, of great importance that this is a trend that we can turn back. One of the strongest, I think, criticisms that I've tried to make during these last months is that a lot of these restrictions have been rolled out without a plan to roll them back. So even if leaders say that they are temporary, we can't hold them accountable to that because we haven't agreed on what temporary means. And I'm happy that some of your research show that some of these restrictions at some places are being rolled back. And I think these examples will be very useful for us when now advocating for more of these restrictions to be rolled back in also other contexts. But in this rapidly changing reality, we need to ensure, of course, transparency. We need to ensure access to reliable information and the enjoyment of the right to health. Not only does that depend on accessible health services, but again, on the possibility for individuals to make informed choices, to rely on information that they have. And safeguarding the freedom of expression and free and independent media are key also in this regard. And this all comes together. And we saw very quickly when reprogramming our development cooperation support to respond to the pandemic, that we couldn't just move resources into the health systems and health services, but we needed to move also resources into supporting maybe a free radio channel or the publishing of information on internet to ensure that freedom of information is as much needed at the core of responding to a health crisis as strengthening health systems. We live in an age of information. Information travels fast, faster even than a virus, I guess. And it impacts all decision-making from governments level down to the individual level. To make the best possible decisions and choices, we need the best possible information. It must be reliable and fact-based. And again, these restrictions are extremely regrettable. And I think again, that the project that you present here today or will present here today show that there are worrying trends in many countries and that some governments might use this pandemic to weaken this and weaken the democratic institutions even more in both authoritarian and democratic countries. And if democratic principles have been undermined during this pandemic, and this is of course extra worrying, that the group of democratic countries, also in this group of countries, you see these trends. And this is of course a conversation that we need to have with more partners and colleagues around the world. But again, as I said, it's pleased to see that there are some countries that have already tried to roll back or remove some restrictions, and that shows that they can be temporary. And of course, we need to make sure that they are temporary and that we then, after that, can continue our struggle to expand space for democracy, for rights, and for individual freedoms. So I think in this current context, the drive for democracy is as relevant as ever, even more relevant than before. And we receive reports like the one presented here today of the potentially negative impacts that measures to combat the pandemic have on civil society and human rights defenders. And in this regard, again, this priority of my government remains very relevant and to make sure that we now continue this work and we don't leave anyone behind when we tackle the crisis. Staffan, I'm going to end now, but as you said in your introduction, Sweden is a long-standing and strong supporter of the promotion and strengthening of human rights, democracy, and rule of law in our partner countries. More than a quarter of Swedish development cooperation through SIDA is dedicated to this area. And through our support, we can make sure that civil society organizations, human rights defenders, journalists, media actors can do their job. But it's also increasingly important that we connect these actors on the ground with actors like you, like V-Dem and your network, so that we have a strengthening network between researchers, decision makers and practitioners on how we can continue to expand the space for democracy and strengthening, not only protect, but continue again to promote the values of democracy for an open and more free society. And again, we need more actors, more countries to join this resistance against democratic backsliding. This is not the time for protectionism and isolation. We must build alliances in support of international law, of human rights law, in support of the international, rule-based international order. And we will remain a strong voice in this from our side. And again, our partnership with V-Dem is crucial. Thank you for the work that you do and for the information that you can provide us and others with. I mean, it's fantastic that your database is free of use for so many actors. I wish more knew it. I wish more used it, because then I think we could be more people aligned in this alliance for democracy. Again, thank you very much. Look very much forward for the seminar today.
Well, thank you very much for your inspiring and kind words. I think we all at the V-Dem Institute very much look forward to exploring more ways how to make our research, our database known to civil society actors, to academics all around the world, so that they can use our data not only to do research, but also to hold their government to account. I think this is a common goal that we have here at the Institute. Now, I'll hand straight over to the Pandem team, because this whole project is really truly a team effort. We've all, I think, grown together a lot since the pandemic started and built also a large infrastructure. We'll share some links in the chat window now during the discussion. We will, therefore, to reflect that this is a team endeavor, we'll also have a team presentation. We will have Jean Lachapelle presenting, a postdoc at the V-Dem Institute, Sandra Grahn, a research associate, and Seraphine Maerz, assistant professor, and Amanda Edgedale, who now has left us, unfortunately, at V-Dem, but is still affiliated and is an assistant professor in the US right now, where also exciting things are about to happen this week, but we're not going to talk about that today, right? So, yeah, I'd like to hand over to Jean Lachapelle and also remind all participants, we're at 96 participants now, that you have the chance to ask your questions, make your comments via an online tool that's called Slido. You see here in the chat window, you see the information. So you go to www.sli.do and you use the hashtag Pandem2020. There's no need to register and you can even vote up the questions that others might have had. And now it's over to Jean.
Thank you, Anna. And thank you, everyone. I speak on behalf of the Pandem team. We're all very excited to be here and present our data and our result. And I'll just introduce the project very briefly before I let my collaborators speak. And we have some slides that I'm waiting to see that are supposed to be shared. So I guess I will start speaking. I believe that Seraphine is supposed to share her slides, but I'm not seeing them. I will begin anyways. So the main motivation for this project, so here's the outline, okay. So we will, yes. So let's go to the beginning. But what I wanted to say is talk about the main motivations for this project. So as Mr. State Secretary has already explained, there is now more than ever an important need to document the violations of democratic standards that have occurred in the world in response to the COVID pandemic. And this is the main goal of this project, documenting these violations in a way that is transparent, that is public, that everyone can use and can be therefore used by policymakers and advocates around the world. using these data, we built also an indicator that could help us tell which countries are most at risk of democratic backsliding, which countries are more worrying currently because of the crisis. And the last motivation is to see whether there's any relationship between violations of democratic standards and public health outcomes. And the idea is to address the claim that there might be a trade-off between respecting democracy and fighting the virus, which is a claim we sometimes hear, that democratic rights should be infringed in order to efficiently fight the virus. So this is something that we are able to test empirically with the data. So as the next slide shows, we aim to address what it means to respect democratic standards. Let's go to the next slide right now. So a good starting point is to look at the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And they have some standards for how states should react in times of crisis. And the key terms are: the response must be proportionate, it must be necessary, and non-discriminatory. So using this and building on political science research, as the next slide will show, we built a 7-type typology, so 7 indicators of violations of democratic standards that we place in 2 broad categories. The first category is what we call illiberal practices. And these are practices that infringe on people's dignity and autonomy. The first type of violation is discriminatory measures. So states can have emergency measures when they're facing a crisis like they are currently, but these measures should not affect disproportionately some groups, and especially vulnerable groups. So that's the first type of violation. A second type of violation that we document are the derogation of so-called non-derogable rights. So the non-derogable rights are defined by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights as rights that even in times of emergency should not be, should be respected. So these include the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom of thought, conscience, and religion, for instance. The third type of violation is abusive enforcement. So states can enforce all kinds of emergency measures like lockdowns, restricts people's movement, but in doing so, they should not use excessive force or violence towards their citizens. A fourth type concerns authoritarian practices. So as has already been mentioned, when a state enacts a state of emergency, there should be a clear time limit, an official time limit. The fifth type that we document are limitations on the legislature. So throughout the crisis, the legislature should be able to oversee lawmaking and provide oversight over the government. The sixth type of violation are official disinformation campaigns that sabotage accountability between the government and the population. So the government should not engage in broad disinformation campaigns to mislead the public about either the nature of the virus or the nature of the government's response. And the seventh type, which belongs to both categories because it can both infringe on the individual's dignity and also sabotages the government's accountability, are restrictions on the media. The media should be able to exercise freely and should be able to report on the virus and the government's response to the crisis. So these are the 7 types, and from them we built some indices that allow us to track the evolution of states' responses to the crisis since March 2020. And now I will let my collaborators speak, Sandra Grahn, in the next slide to explain how we aggregated the measures and some of our main findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Jean. So yes, let's just jump right into the next slide, where we have illustrated in a graph some of our, or all of our empirical findings. So this graph shows how the distribution of countries that have had no minor, some, or major violations. So in the different categories. And as you can see, light green means no violations, teal colored means minor violations, blue is some, and purple is major violations. And there are some occurrences of violations of human rights, such as the discriminatory measures, for instance, the top category. And there we have found things such as states having lockdowns only in neighborhoods where minorities live. For instance, in Bulgaria, we have seen this. And there are also some occurrences of violations of accountability. As you can see, there are some violations on all these bars. And for instance, allowing the executive to rule by decree, that is to allow them to bypass parliament in making restrictions and COVID-related laws. We see these in several countries that have a state of emergency, that this is part of the state of emergency. For instance, in Bolivia, this has occurred. But as you can clearly see here, by far the most frequently observed type of violations is type 7, the restrictions on media. And as you can see, over half of the countries have major violations in this area. So, for instance, so what would that look like? For instance, in Philippines and Serbia, among many other countries, media is restricted in what they can report on or how they can report. For instance, in Philippines, journalists or anyone can go to prison for up to 2 months for spreading false information, while in Serbia, it is penalized any release of information that is not authorized by the Prime Minister or the COVID task force. The media is also limited in its how limited in information accessible to the media. For instance, in Guatemala, the government stopped holding press conferences altogether for a while and limited the information in general that it shared with the press. So it was very hard for the journalists to get information on what was actually happening in the country. And not only are they restricted in what information they can receive and what information they can give out, journalists are also harassed and subject to violence. For instance, in Uganda, many journalists have been beaten, forced to delete pictures after having tried to cover news stories about police enforcing lockdowns. And so if we go to the next slide, we see that, so we have aggregated these categories that were on the previous slide. We have aggregated them into an index, and that is illustrated on this map, where we see violations of democratic standards in COVID-19 emergency measures. So this is not a map of democracy levels, but a map of how severely democratic standards have been compromised in the emergency measures in different countries. So on the positive side, 42% of all the countries have committed no or only minor violations. So 16 countries have not violated any democratic standard whatsoever, And the examples you can see here in bright green, there are Finland, Canada, Portugal, New Zealand, etc. So that is good news, 16 countries. And we also have 44 countries that have also committed minor violations, which is things like isolated instances of limited access for information, for instance. So that is good news. However, we also find, and as you can see on the map, that 84 of the countries have more severe infringements of democratic standards. The majority of them were authoritarian before the pandemic, but 14 of them were democracies, which is worrisome. For instance, many of you may draw your eyes to the US on this map. The US had no time limit on the national emergency, which is their state of emergency law. They had journalists that have been denied access to information, and public officials have been prohibited from talking to the media. And the president himself have personally harassed journalists and spread misinformation. So this happens both in democracies and in authoritarian states at the moment. And we move to next slide. So yes, how did things change since the beginning of the crisis? There's been a while now. What has happened? Move to next slide again. And so the trends that we see is that overall, things have improved over the last 3 months. Almost a quarter of countries that engaged in violations of democratic standards have improved their situation. For instance, Ghana is a good example. They have decreased their violent enforcement. So things have gotten better in a lot of countries. And most violations that we found occurred between March and June, or at least started then, and some of them might still be going on, but between March and June was the worst. And so again, that is the good news. However, some major violations still persist in 65 countries. So there are some countries to watch. Countries that have violated democratic standards and risk backsliding into a more authoritarian rule. We see, for instance, in Sri Lanka, there has been discrimination against Muslim burials, which is not in line with the WHO recommendations. We see media restrictions in India and in Mexico, and we see police brutality going on still in South Africa, Philippines, Uganda, and in El Salvador, we have recorded a number of violations, such as the limitations of the legislature, derogation of non-degrowable rights, etc. So there are still things going on in countries that we really need to watch to see where they're going and to ensure that they are not sliding back into an authoritarian state. And you can also, by yourself, explore our data on our online dashboard on a link that I think was accessible on the slide. Yeah. All right. I was going to hand over to Seraphine, but she appears to have disappeared.
All right, until Seraphine gets back here, let's maybe take a first round of questions, actually, because I think it's quite nice to go in between, and then we'll see until we get the presentation back up. It's actually a nice stop point, because we already on Slido, we got quite some interesting questions. And Mr. State Secretary, I think they're mainly political questions, so I hand them over to you. There are two questions that have been voted up by the users, and that I'll just combine because they're very similar. So one question is, what is the best way to engage with government stakeholders in combating disinformation and hate speech during the pandemic? So that would be the first question. Maybe we start with that one.
Thank you. Again, what is the best way to engage with governments? Can you phrase it again, please?
Exactly. So how can we engage with governments to fight disinformation and hate speech? Sort of. So what are policy recommendations, for example?
Well, first of all, I think there ought to be no restrictions on what information you can publish or what press is allowed. That is one thing that governments should be able to work on. And then I think it's the access issues, to make sure that there's no digital gap, for example, a divide where who can access information on the internet, for example, who is allowed to seek information for yourself. And then I think there needs to be no you need also to have a media atmosphere where you have no self-regulatory or no self-censorship from journalists or media actors, so that there's no threat of response from government officials after you have presented information, or so on and so forth. And I think that is a type of demand that you should be able to, or you have to put on your decision makers, and therefore for your government. So allow for an access to information, that individuals can access information themselves without restriction, and then also to remove all types of threats on journalists, on media outlets, that can be pulled afterwards somehow if you publish information that is against your government, for example. So access and then the freedom of publishers, I think, is two main things that a government has to ensure also during a pandemic. And then I think if you're a journalist, you should definitely organize yourself. We see also countries where they have a large union of journalists, for example, are stronger in these demands and have a better possibility of engaging in dialogue with their decision makers. So this also comes back to the freedom of assembly and the freedom of organizing yourself.
Yes, indeed. And if I can add two thoughts here from our coding or project process. So first of all, what we've seen in many countries, and this also explains to a large extent why so many countries score so badly on the media indicators, is that they have passed laws with very draconic penalties for journalists for spreading disinformation. And that indeed creates an information environment where journalists don't dare to actually report about this topic. So this was really problematic, and if at all there needs to be some sort of regulation on disinformation, then this should be very, very targeted, explicit, and specific. So what we've done, and that's my second point here in our coding process, when we've coded government disinformation, Seraphine will talk more about that in a second, we have actually looked into communication that deviates from the WHO official recommendations. So that's sort of we've presented our coders with a clear guideline on what counts as disinformation and what actually is subject to different policy preferences, for example, or different interpretations. So.
And maybe just I'm not going to take longer now on this in this question, but also what we see from some decision makers is also a new type of discourse, a new language where you distrust media. And of course, if you from your very privileged position talk about journalism and media with a very degraded discourse, of course this also spreads mistrust from the broader population towards media, and this is just taking the back door to a more restricted media freedom, which of course should not be tolerated, I think. And if you are a privileged decision maker, if you're in this position, you need to be very careful on how you speak about media, even when they report things that is not to your best.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, indeed. So I believe now we can continue with the presentation, right? Amanda?
Sure, yes. Let me just load it. Seraphine is here.
Yes, I'm back, and apologies for the disruption.
Okay, just 1 second. We have we'll have the presentation in a second. I just want to highlight also that I've posted here in the chat window, I've posted links to our policy brief and the data dashboard where everyone can explore the data themselves, and also a working paper that we'll introduce now to you.
So shall I continue, or
yes.
should Seraphine? Okay. Okay, you should be able to see the slides again, everyone.
Yes, perfect.
You can go back to my part, so I can do the presentation now.
Sure.
Thanks, Amanda. All right, so in the following, I'm going to talk about one type of violation or authoritarian practice during the COVID-19 pandemic, official disinformation campaigns. And why is this a violation of democratic standards? One crucial aspect here is that it's official disinformation campaigns. So it's not disinformation merely spread by some kind of extremist media outlet, but it's officially supported, spread, and propagated by the president, for example, or a prime minister of a country. And if this is the case, if we observe official disinformation, then we are talking about an authoritarian practice which sabotages and significantly harms accountability, because it obviously hinders the population to access truthful and fact-based information. And especially if combined with media restrictions, as it is often the case. What kind of official disinformation campaigns do we observe during COVID-19? And here, yes, thank you. You can move on to the next slide. And on this slide, you see that we propose 3 different categories in this regard. The first and worst are the so-called denialists. Those governments which completely deny any outbreak of the disease in their country, even though it is highly likely, or there are even credible sources which prove that there are occurrences of COVID-19 in the country. Overall, such extreme cases of denial are rather rare, but still we see this happening, for example, in Turkmenistan, but also in Burundi, in Nicaragua, Tanzania, and so on. The second category are the anti-scientists, and we called them as such because they typically spread disinformation about a lot of things, such as treatments, or they downplay the risks of COVID-19, but importantly, they do not fully deny the occurrence of COVID-19 cases in their country, and that is also how they distinguish themselves from the first category. The last category are what we call the curists, because these countries propagate and officially recommend treatments for COVID-19 which are not proven cures. And you see here listed quite a few African countries, because we observe in these countries not only the malaria, the official support of the malaria treatment hydroxychloroquine, which has been wrongly claimed to also cure COVID-19, but there's also, in addition to that, the so-called COVID organics. which is a herbal plant-based drink from Madagascar, which was and still is officially promoted also in other African countries, although there is no proof whatsoever that it actually helps to cure COVID-19 symptoms. Right, before I move on to talk a little bit more about single examples of these three categories, one last and more general question: how frequent is this violation of democratic standards or authoritarian practices of officially spreading disinformation during COVID-19? And as you can see on the slide, we observe only 25 cases overall, which score high in this regard. And only 4 cases actually, which score extremely high by completely denying COVID-19 cases in their countries. So this kind of violation is comparatively rare, but we still deem it very important to be monitored because it captures all those governments which do not enact overly strict and inadequate measurements, but which prove to perform very poorly in order to handle the crisis and also purposely act here very irresponsible. Right, now let's move on with the slides also to some concrete examples for each of the 3 categories. First, Turkmenistan, one of the worst autocracies in the world, a highly isolated and very restrictive country. So it is maybe not so surprising that this is also an example of the denialists. What you can see here on the picture is a mass cycle rally in Turkmenistan in April 2020 on the so-called Day of Health. And officially, until today, no case of COVID-19 has been reported, and the regime actually also avoids talking about COVID-19 or Corona. And given that media restrictions are very high in this country, and as said before, this is also the case for other cases of official disinformation. So there seems to be a core occurrence of propagating disinformation and also limiting the media. Yes, so given these very strict limitations of civil and media freedoms in Turkmenistan, the denial of proper information about COVID-19 in the country poses a serious risk for Turkmen citizens and actually also the entire Central Asian region. Moving on to the next example, one slide, thank you. The US President Donald Trump as anti-scientist. This case of official disinformation has been broadly discussed in international media. The Guardian, for example, among others, published a list of the wrong and misleading claims of Trump about COVID-19, such as his attempts to downplay the virus or his support of unproven treatments via Twitter. And as you can see here also on the slide, Twitter even reacted to this attempt to spread disinformation via the platform by clearly positioning itself here against using Twitter for spreading any kind of disinformation. But it is unfortunately still happening. So let's move on to our last example, the courists. Here you see the Madagascar president drinking and therefore also officially promoting the already mentioned herbal drink COVID Organics. And while the ingredients of this herbal drink might be indeed harmless, it is actually quite concerning if this is claimed and officially claimed to cure COVID-19 symptoms, since people might then indeed take it as a proper treatment instead of looking for real medical help in case of emergencies. So overall, our observation of the different kinds of official disinformation is very worrying, which is also why we need to further monitor such violations during this ongoing pandemic, especially if they occur together with existing or new restrictions of media freedom. Now my colleague Amanda continues.
Thank you, Seraphine. So to kind of bring us full circle, I guess, You know, so we've talked a lot about the different ways that leaders and governments have violated democratic standards for emergency measures during COVID-19, but oftentimes they do so by claiming that it's more efficient, that we need to sacrifice these freedoms and democracy, at least temporarily. That's the framing they use. In order to eliminate the disease, to protect human life. And so in our recent working paper, we assess whether violations of democratic standards can be justified in the name of human life. So are these leaders who claim to be engaging in police brutality and enforcement, engaging in limitations on the media, extreme situations where the executive has almost near full control over issuing decrees, are all of these behaviors justified in the name of human life, as many of the governments and leaders who are engaging in them claim they are? And some examples here to give you concrete evidence of this. So we have here the Philippine president, Rodrigo Duterte, claiming that it's worth the sacrifice, that the numbers are much lower because the government there has prioritized life over all other considerations, including people's human rights. In addition, we have an example of Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban, who instructs his citizens that they need to leave their comfort zone and essentially give him supreme authority to rule by decree in order to combat the pandemic. And so we question in our recent working paper whether or not these sort of justifications for violations of democratic standards actually do result in lower death tolls from the pandemic thus far. And in order to do this, we run a statistical model. And in that model, we account for various other structural conditions in the country that would also likely affect death rates. Some of these include life expectancy, the proportion of the population that's over the age of 65, prevalence of respiratory disease in the country, as well as the overall health system capacity of the country based on investment, healthcare expenditures, as well as data on health quality and reporting by the government. And when we account for all of these structural features in a country that will already make it more or less likely to experience severe pandemics, we find that violating democratic standards has really no effect on the predicted number of deaths that a country will experience during the COVID-19 pandemic thus far. In other words, our research shows that there's no evidence of this trade-off between democracy and efficient responses to COVID-19, as many leaders and governments have claimed during the pandemic. Violations of democratic standards during this crisis simply cannot be justified for better public health outcomes. And given what we know about the other benefits of democracy in terms of well-being, human rights, and dignity of individuals and societies, we conclude that you really can't justify violations of democratic standards during a pandemic, that there are ways to do this that don't violate those human rights and dignity. And we've already seen this in countries like Taiwan and South Korea, where their responses were efficient and they didn't sacrifice these democratic norms that we've measured here in our data. And so to put it bluntly, no, it's not worth the sacrifice. And now I'll hand it over to my colleague, Anna, who will wrap up with a preview of where you can find all of our online resources.
Right, thanks, team. We go to the next slide already. So first of all, we have an interactive dashboard at our website where you can really look in detail how a country that you're interested in scores on any aspect of democratic violations during the pandemic. We go to the next one. And then we even have a GitHub that looks more complicated than it is. It's really quite easy. You can find your country, and then you find all the sources that we've used, and you can really, also if you find anything that you find not so convincing, feel free to send us an email so we can improve it in the next version. Then if we go to the next slide, yes, we've also already published several research papers, 3 policy briefs, and the working paper that Amanda has just introduced about the question whether it's actually worth the sacrifice. And then to close, I'd also like to thank the whole team that made this possible. It's not only the people who have presented right now, but it's also our research assistants, Paul Bederke, Anna Flavia Goodgod, Martin Lundstedt, Natalia Naziska, Sriya Pillai, and Palina Calvani. So big thank you to all of you for really meticulously dealing with this data and these questions every round, every update. And also I would like to thank several of V-Dem regional managers and country managers, and that have been very helpful, particularly when it came to version 1 and 2 of the data, developing the questionnaire and providing sort of a baseline of reliability and validity. So that's those are all the do things that I really wanted to say right now. I would say we take, we said we would aim for an hour, now it's almost 4, so, but I would say we'll take some more of the questions that we have from Slido, and aim for maybe 10 minutes now of addressing those questions. On Slido, first we have a question on from Luca Verstegen. Is the extent of violation moderated by prior levels of democratic standards, such that the country with higher standards are violating less? The map suggests so. I don't know, does anyone want to take this? Otherwise I can address it. Maybe Sandra, do you want to say something? You have already said it before, so. You're muted.
Classic. Thank you. Sorry, could you please repeat the question?
So it's on the, if we have more violations of democratic standards in countries with higher standards before.
Well, we have violations in both democracies and autocracies. Majority. Let's see if I had the number here, but a majority of them were already autocracies before. I think it was 22 or something. But we also see some in democracies, so it's a little bit spread out. But the mostly we see that it is more authoritarian countries, and mostly countries that are not fully authoritarian maybe, but in the middle ground, that we see most violations, because they really make use of this situation to grab some more power perhaps with this pandemic.
Exactly. And also for Luca, if you want to read deeper into this, you can go to this last policy brief that we published on figure 3, gives you a breakdown of the division between sort of prior democracies and autocracies and the violations of democratic standards. So we have to be vigilant everywhere. We have a question on another question on disinformation, but I think we discussed that already quite extensively. So maybe I'll combine 2 questions for you, Per Olsson, Fridh, which are precisely on the topic of the drive for democracy. So we have here Pedro de Carvalho asking the phenomenon of democratic deconsolidation has already been diagnosed for a while, right? We know that. So how can we collectively fight against that tendency? That's one question. Sort of what are concrete measures that governments or also individual citizens could take? And then there has been another question directed to you from Jean. It says that in your introductory remarks, you said that wherever democracy can grow, so that sort of there you try to support it, right? So what do you believe is required to grow democracy worldwide?
Thank you. I mean, it's especially the last question is not so easy to answer, but maybe the drive for democracy itself is our try to answer that. But let me say that I think, how can we collectively fight against the backsliding of democracy, and what is needed for us to support democracy where it can grow? And I think one thing is to also break down what democracy can mean and what it means to us, and what seeds are there in the different contexts for democracy to grow. Now, I believe that every window of opportunity that is just opened a little, that you could open up fully, will allow for a democratic, fresh air to fly in your window, and that itself will also open up new windows of opportunities. So I think you need to dig where you stand, and you need to work with things that are possible for you to work with, be it more gender equal participation, more human rights, more freedom of information, media literacy, there's so many parts, LGBTI rights. There's so many parts of democracy that you can choose to work with where you can, and use that ground, that space of a new more democratic narrative, to build on that space and expand into new spaces where you can build on new participation in democratic institutions. So you don't have to work with your legislation and your constitution. The first thing you do, start where you are, dig where you stand, and work with what you have, and slowly build alliances from that. But we said very early when we launched our drive for democracy that when democracy is backsliding, the farmer becomes a rights advocate, and with those types of examples, the librarian that runs the library becomes a freedom of speech activist. And so we have to change our behavior also. We have to see and look upon ourselves and each other as advocates for democracy. And we need to join hands and build new alliances between the farmer and the librarian so that we can move democratic space forward. And I think these things you can work with, not everywhere, but in most contexts. And when democracy is backsliding, it's extremely important to join those hands to stop that backsliding from going even further. We have, Sweden has 1% of our GDP devoted to ODA, devoted to international aid. And we work with strategies in almost 40 countries with bilateral support. All of those strategies contain democracy, human rights work, gender equality work, support of rule of law. But then we also have regional strategies in all parts of the world, where we support regional cooperation to enhance and support human rights advocates, defenders, judiciaries and other actors working on expanding democracy, strengthening the institutions of democracy. And I must just, because this will be my final word probably during this seminar, democracy has its crisis, but to be frank, it's the institutions of democracy that have its crisis. It's the decision makers of democracy that have its crisis. All over the world, people are taking to the streets in Santiago, in Bogota, in Khartoum, in Beirut, in Tehran, in Hong Kong, everywhere. People are taking to the streets. And what do they demand? They demand more participation, more accountability, more transparency, and they demand a new order for which their voices are heard and taken better into account. So democracy is not having a crisis. The values of democracy is deeply rooted among people in all continents, all around the world. And their demand for democracy, those are the ones that we now need to partner with, need to equip them with tools, with the data that you can, V-Dem can provide them with, and with the arguments and the support, financial support from governments like my own, so that we can build democracy from underneath and up. And that is not where the crisis is. The crisis is the people on the top who do want to backslide and press down democracy. But among people, the demand for democracy is strong, and that is our hope, and that is what we need to hold on to.
Exactly, thank you. Yeah, already our democracy report that we published in March this year, we've seen that last year, 2019, was the year with the highest level of pro-democratic mass mobilization that we ever had in the history. So really the demand for democracy is clearly there. Nevertheless, we have a question here from the audience, from Moise, who asks why are non-democratic states, China and Russia, at the forefront of finding a vaccine and liberal democracy struggling with pandemic lockdowns? Maybe Staffan, you want to give it a start, and then whoever wants to add can add.
Sure. It is true that China and Russia are seeking to be on the forefront of finding a vaccine. It would be a huge PR victory, of course, for these authoritarian systems to be able to provide the world with a saving vaccine. So I think that's why we're seeing them working so hard on that. Obviously, I think they also want to solve problems in their own countries, but we should not be fooled that any of these countries are some altruistic actors in the international system, because they're not. And then I think it's not only liberal democracies that are struggling with pandemic lockdowns. I think the data that you have just seen during the seminar and the policy brief that's available online, and Nazifa put the link in the chat so you can all download it if you want, shows very clearly that there are also a long series of democracies that have handled the pandemic really well, from South Korea and Taiwan in the east to Denmark and Norway, and also countries other places. And there are many authoritarian countries that have handled the pandemic really badly and are struggling with lockdowns. I mean, look at what's going on in Iran, look at what's going on in Russia right now. So I don't think it is particular for liberal democracies that they are struggling with a pandemic. That's the short answer.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Does anyone want to add on that question?
Yeah, I might add that this shows the importance of collecting systematic data on governments' practices around the world, because it's very easy to come up with some cases where it seems like these authoritarian regimes are doing better, but we need to look at the entire universe. We need to look at all of them. So as researchers, we try to collect systematic data. So that's it might look, if we focus just on a few cases, that authoritarian regimes are performing better, but this is not a very scientific way of approaching the problem.
Right. And also here I want to highlight an article that our colleague Karl-Henrik Knudsen is about to publish in the Journal of Democracy, where he has systematically looked at the performance of democracies and autocracies across a wide range of indicators, among them health outcomes. And as Jean has highlighted, he shows there that indeed we have some outliers of countries, of autocracies that might perform well, have good years of growth, for example, but the bulk of autocracies are underperforming democracies in general. So we shouldn't just look at these spectacular outlier cases, but rather sort of at the overall systematic differences, and we have big reasons to believe that with the mechanisms of accountability, of transparency, democracies can ensure better outcomes for their people. Let me maybe just take one or two more questions, and then we'll come to a close. Just because there's so much debate going on right now. So we have another question from Patricia Silva. The pandemic social dynamics seem to echo the rally around the flag, with parties and media falling silent. What can be done in absence of elite criticism? Does anyone have a go on that? Seraphine, maybe? Or you can also think about it maybe for a second. And I'll just highlight some additional questions. How to protect the freedom of expression in the media when it's controlled by governments, and to safeguard the rights of citizens. I think here the answer clearly points also to the internet and the experiences that we have, particularly in this mass mobilization for democracies, that citizens can circumvent the state-controlled media and use the internet directly to address these issues. And then maybe a final question here from Renato Caccettini, I believe. The question is, I don't think we're going to experience a reverse in democratic erosion in the short term, but how do we survive in a world where denialists and anti-scientists are in power?
Well, and I can say something very briefly on the first question. I think we're seeing a rally around the flag effect in many places. And in a healthy democracy facing a crisis for a short period, that is not necessarily a problem. But if a crisis like this stokes very high levels of fear, then the risk is, and I think we've seen this in a number of places, that people start to accept strongmen's proposals to curtail democratic rights and civil liberties that are then hard to roll back. Your own work also shows this with state of emergencies as lingering for decades sometimes, even when the cause of the original state of emergency has disappeared, and they are being used for political purposes and to pursue political opponents. And that is a great risk, I think.
Yes, indeed. All right. Any more comments on questions or final thoughts? Otherwise, I think we already, Per Olsson Fridh already had a great closing statement. So I think that really served very well to drive home the message of the drive for democracy. So then I'd like to thank all participants for joining us today from all corners of the world. I mean, also here the team is distributed across 2 continents. We hope to keep you updated on the pandemic backsliding in the next quarters as well. So watch out for our next update mid-December, and then future updates to come hopefully next year as well. We're happy if you use our data both in your research as well as for advocacy, and are also happy to answer any questions you might have. Well then, thank you and have a good day.